Matthew 5. All right, so if you're just joining us for the first time here or new to our midst, we've been talking about conversations with Jesus. Can everybody see the screen, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a little bit taller and bigger than the last one, right? Let's give it up for our AV and worship crew. Come on, guys. Again, if you're new around here, you know, we had a smaller screen and it was torn and it had like a little fluffy dog ear on one corner. And, you know, God is blessing our efforts. So now everybody can see. You're not having to like jump over the road behind, you know, in front of you to see the screen that was basically like right here at my head height. We've been talking about these conversations with Jesus. And last week we talked about the parable of the sower. We talked about Matthew 13. And we were talking about the rocks and the thorns that can get in our life. And we briefly mentioned Jesus' words about lust, specifically in Matthew 5. And over the next few weeks, we're going to actually dive into these chapters here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 as we discuss what's commonly referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Obviously, there's far too much for us to adequately cover in a few weeks everything that is in the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to sort of do some cursory reading, some sort of high-level flyovers, and then we're going to kind of dive into a couple of specific points. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that the Sermon on the Mount isn't necessarily a sermon. It's not a sermon. Most scholars believe that this is a compilation work, like a greatest hits album, compiled by Matthew, and then there's a parallel account in Luke. And most people believe that this is sort of the condensation, the essence of Jesus' teaching that he taught his disciples over the course of years. The words in the Sermon on the Mount are incredibly practical. And you can't help, when you read them, to be utterly convicted. I mean, this is some of the best, like, one-liner zingers you're ever going to hear. Yeah. You know, you think James is zinging it when he talks about, you don't come to work late, come to church on time. Jesus goes even a step above that. And maybe a few steps beyond that. So we're going to sort of start in chapter 5. We're going to sort of skim through the beginning parts and dive into a couple of the later sections. And as a qualifier, some of the things that I say today and talk about have come from others as well that have influenced me, like N.T. Wright, William Barclay, and others. So in the beginning of chapter 5, you begin with what's known as the Beatitudes. How many of you have ever read the Beatitudes? How many of you have ever heard a sermon about Jesus' sermon on the Beatitudes? Okay, this is all fairly familiar to us. He uses this word blessed, or blessed, if you're down here in the South. Blessed. And here, this word means joy. It means a God-like joy. It is opposed to our concept of happiness. The English word happy gives itself away because of the root hap, which means chance. Human happiness is something that is dependent on chance, dependent on circumstances, the changes of life. Something that life can give or take away. This is not the blessedness that Jesus is referring to. The world can win its joys, and the world can equally lose its joys. A change in fortune, a collapse in health, the failure of your plan, the disappointment of an ambition, even the change in weather. It's gotten pretty hot around here. You might have lost some of your happiness. Unless you're like me and a Florida boy, and I'm actually gaining some of my happiness because it's getting warmer. The world takes away. That happiness was being taken away too. Get him, Alex! All right. Hope that wasn't mine. Okay. The world can give joy, but it's fickle. The world can give happiness, but it's fickle. The Beatitudes speak of a joy that's permanent, that seeks us through our pain. The joy which sorrow and loss, pain and grief are powerless to touch. The joy that shines through tears and even death. As Christians, we have this serene and untouchable joy which comes from walking with Jesus. in his presence. So as we glance over the Beatitudes, the question that I think of is, are we walking serenely with the company of Jesus? Do we have a lasting joy? Or are we found in this cycle of turmoil and happiness that ebbs and flows based on the circumstances? The Beatitudes are not pious hopes or idealistic visions of what shall be. Jesus says they are here now. The blessedness that belongs to Christians is not a blessedness that's postponed for some later date, some future world of glory. It's a blessedness which exists right here and right now. It's not something as Christians we will enter. It's something that we have already entered. Isn't that good news? Yep. Matthew continues on. In verse 13, he starts talking about Jesus' fulfillment of the law. Here we're introduced to what Matthew is really getting to the heart of for the whole sermon, chapters 5 through 7. This is the heart of what Matthew's really getting at. Jesus has come to fulfill the law and prophets. And then he goes on, and the rest of the sermon kind of explicitly states what that means. Jesus is calling Israel of his day, right? He's not speaking at this time to 21st century Americans. He's speaking to first century Jews. And these Jews had a long history and a long lineage, which we've been talking about over the last several months. Jesus is speaking to them, and he's calling them to be the people that God wanted them to be. And they had strayed. And he starts talking about salt and light. And salt in the ancient world was used as a preservative, to preserve something, to keep it from rotting, from going bad. This is how Jesus' hearers would have heard his words. He's saying, how can God use you when you've rotted to preserve the rest of the world? You think they would have been offended? That was an offensive statement. For Jesus to say, you, Israel, have lost your saltiness. Meaning you're no longer the people of God, chosen by him to be a light and preservative to the rest of the world. To keep the rest of the world from going bad. So for us, as Christians, are we salty? Or have we lost our saltiness? I think for us, we have to figure out, where does the world need salt and light right now? Where does the world need preservation? Where is it going awry? Where is it rotting? Where is it going bad? That's where God wants to put his salt. Have we lost our distinctive taste, church? Let's continue to dive in verse 21. So, high-level, cursory glancing at the beginning of the chapter. Now let's dive in. Murder. You murdered anyone lately? A lot of people have been murdered lately. Even right here in our own community. Just a couple of weeks ago. People were murdered. He says in verse 21, you have heard it said that it was said to the people long ago. Again, referencing Israel's heritage, the law of Moses, their spiritual roots. You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Rakah, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then, come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court, and do it while you are still together on the way. Or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and who knows? The judge might hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. What's Jesus' point here? have heard it said, but I tell you even this. And this is a theme that we'll see in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, you've heard it, but you ain't really heard it. It's like white man can't jump, you know. You hear it, Jimmy, but you can't hear Jimmy. Okay? You're hearing Jesus, but are we really hearing Jesus? Jesus says that reconciliation takes precedence even over worship.
Come on.
Do you know how profound that would have been to these people? To leave your gift at the altar for most of his Galilean hearers would have meant about a 3-day journey to Jerusalem. Anyone travel 3 days to get here? No. And he says, you need to leave your animal that you would have traveled with for 3 days, or if you were really savvy and had the money, you would have left your animal at home and taken the money to Jerusalem to buy one there. So you didn't have the inconvenience of having to make the trip with animals. He says, leave it there in Jerusalem. Leave it in the temple. Leave it next to the altar where the priests are getting ready to slaughter it. And then go back home 3 days. Go find that dude and say, I'm sorry. Then come back another 3 days. Find your wandering animal in the temple somewhere. And then slaughter it and sacrifice it to God. It would have been so exaggerant, this example. It would be like, get in your car and drive to Tennessee just to say you're sorry and then come back here to church. Hurry up, we're waiting. Jesus' point is exaggerated to make the point crystal clear. We must live in a way, day by day, that when we come here to worship God, or we worship God in any way, privately, and any day, there can be no anger between us and our neighbor, our brother and sister. Our worship to God is not acceptable if you are not reconciled to your brother or sister. I would love to see someone get up right now and walk out to go be reconciled to someone. I would love for you to tap someone in the room that you're not reconciled with and get up and walk out. We wouldn't think it was weird. We would think that you were taking Jesus' words seriously and that you were following him as his disciple. Reconciliation with God is a big deal. We want to be forgiven by the one who can destroy both our body and soul in hell. But to God, this reconciliation that he paid for dearly also comes with the price tag that we be reconciled to one another. Everybody wants to be reconciled with God. Not everybody wants to be reconciled with their brother or spouse. Well, there's one. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a minute. Jesus talks about it. Romans 12:18, Paul said, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Meaning, you can't control other people, but as long as you have the power to do something, do it in order to live at peace. And then later, in chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, we'll talk about this some more next week, Jesus himself says, if you don't forgive others, God will what? Not forgive you. Reconciliation between people is a big deal to God. Even as we read and we understand the weight of Jesus' words here, and how crazy difficult and unlike the world they are, we got to keep in mind as we read the Sermon on the Mount, it's not just Jesus giving us moral commands. It's not Jesus just giving us a new morality. He is telling us about a new way to be human. He's rewriting humanity from the ground up. It's not a tweak. It's not a little course correction. It's a completely new beginning. No wonder it looks strange to us. We continue on in verse 27. Oh, You guys ready? Please grab out your Bibles if you don't yet. Turn on your screens. I would encourage you. A paper Bible is always helpful because, they don't tend to power down. But if you don't have a Bible, please find a way to look on with somebody. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And as I mentioned last week, obviously Jesus isn't showing favorites to the male species. This principle goes both ways. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. I'm assuming that like Jesus' hearers, all of us here aren't wanting to be thrown into hell. Okay? If you do, this is the wrong meeting for you. Okay? There's something else somewhere else that you could find. Being thrown into hell was not what these people wanted. For good reason. Continues on, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Well, thank you very much, ex-husband. I now have a piece of paper. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oaths, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is the footstool of him, or by Jerusalem, the holy city, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your own head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. Well, I guess we can make them blonde and stuff if we want, but Jesus' point still stands. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Jesus set his face firmly against divorce. And this passage shows us not only that, but also that the early church wrestled with how to apply this in practice. And this is a challenging passage for a person in my shoes to preach. Why? Because divorce happens. It happens a lot. And most statistics will tell you that it happens to the tune of about 50% of marriages. And inside the church, Jesus' church, it's about the same. There's really not much statistical variation there. And apparently, Jesus had some similar statistics. He said, you know what? Moses permitted you to divorce. This is later on in Matthew 18. That's not God's intent. And so here Jesus is getting pressed about divorce. And he's saying, you know what? You have heard it said that anyone can divorce a wife. As long as you have a certificate, it's official. But I tell you that no one should divorce except for by sexual immorality. And if you do, you make them a victim of adultery. What's implied there is when they remarry. You know, it's interesting. Matthew's mention of divorce here is sandwiched between two other issues that are a bit more basic. The control of bodily lust, passage right before it, and commitment to integrity and absolute truth-telling right after it. It's kind of interesting, right? Divorce happens many times when lust and lies have been allowed to grow up like weeds, and they choke this fragile flower of marriage. You know, I grew up witnessing in my own family and in the families of others around me a lot of divorce. A lot of families were riddled with divorce and a lot of fractures in the families. Especially in the boomer generation, the generation just before me. And so I think it produced in me, and much of my generation, the Generation X, along with the millennials, a desire to not even get married. Why bother? Seems like such a waste of time. Seems like so much pain. For what? You know, and I was scared to death to marry my wife. Luckily, by this point, I had become a disciple of Jesus, and I had committed my way to following him, and I had started finding ways to try to practically live these teachings. And you fast forward a decade, and I guess God saw fit that I would at least be ready to start marriage with one of his daughters. It took me a little while. But I'm so grateful that it took as long as it did. Because marriage is tough work. And anybody that tells you otherwise is simply lying to you.
That's true.
And they probably have an ulterior motive. Britt and I had long and very serious discussions about divorce and about my fears, because it is what I had seen and grown up around, and it's what my worldview was painted with. And I knew that we don't live in a fairy tale world, even in the church. I had seen friends of mine, even in the church, get married and divorced. But I believe Matthew is giving us a window into Jesus' teachings here about how to safeguard our marriages from divorce. You know, Britt was amazing during those periods when we were courting and we were talking and we were engaged and we were talking about marriage. And I said, look, I'm afraid we might get divorced one day. And ultimately, we both knew that we don't have ultimate control of that. We only have control of one side of that, right? But we said, you know what? We're going to commit our way to the Lord. And if we stay focused on that, we're going to trust that he'll get us through whatever comes. And I was so grateful for her grace, because I was really scared. I was like, wow, what happens if this doesn't work? I know how evil and wicked I am. You, Britt, don't as much, because, you know, I kind of shield you from that as much as I can so that you'll like me and keep going out with me. I'm being a bit funny. I actually was very upfront with her about all my weaknesses. And in fact, I was very upfront with her about the issue of lust and pornography and sexual sin in my life, both before I became a Christian and after. And I said, I want you to know who I am, so that you can count the cost on what it means to yoke yourself to me. And we had very frank conversations. The last thing I was going to do was dupe someone into marrying me, because I knew that would not work. I'd seen that happen too many times before. So we had frank conversations, and some of them were very hard, and there were tears shed. And there have been many since. But this is what Jesus is getting at with the passage about oaths, about telling the truth, about being transparent. The first thing he says is, we got to deal radically and ruthlessly at the first signs of lust. And I think Jesus' mindset here about how to deal with sin applies to all sin, not just lust, but he's picking this one. And he says, plucking out eyes and cutting off hands and throwing them away is what needs to happen. Wow. Anybody here ever plucked out their own eye? Some early Christians did. They wrote about it. You can go and read some of these early Christian writings, especially some of the monastic fathers. Took these words literally. And then they would write later in their life, you know what? I can still sin with one eye. I can still sin with one hand. Or no hands. So Jesus' words are deliberately exaggerated to make a point. What's the point? It's the same exaggeration that he just said about the animals. Leaving your gift at the altar and going and being reconciled. You need to be willing to go to whatever length you have to be reconciled and to get sin and temptation out of your life. Last week, the parable of the sowers, we talked about those rocks and those weeds and those thorns in our life. And sometimes we get tricked into thinking a rock is a flower. We need other objective eyes to help us see, no, that's actually a massive boulder in the soil of your heart. No, that's actually sin, brother. We can't pet that. We can't justify that. We can't circumvent that. That's not righteous. Let's deal with it together. Let's not turn a blind eye. Amen?
Amen.
This is where we're going, guys. If we're following Jesus, this is where we're going. We're not going to avoid. Obviously, his exaggeration makes his point with great force. And last week I kind of talked about this passage, and I talked about how I don't have internet on my phone. Somebody came up to me later and was like, "Oh, you don't have internet on your phone. Here, let me give you the lyrics to the song we're singing right now." I said, "Oh, man, thank you. Appreciate that." I was just going to... and just look at Mickey and hopefully he'll bail me out, you know. Give me that lead word, bro. And I mentioned last week, I said, you know, sometimes a brother or a sister will confess sin. And maybe they'll confess sin of lust or pornography or masturbation or some other sexual sin. And many times my question will be, how did that happen? If you looked at pornography, how did you get to it? And if it's the same way that you got to it the time before, and the time before that, and the 14 times before that, I say, what are you doing? You're not cutting off, and you're not plucking out. There's going to be a lot of temptation that we can't control. Nobody can control who walks through that door right now. Well, you can control what kind of phone you put in your pocket. You can control if you know that you have access to sin and you decide to do nothing about trying to remove that access. You can control that. It's black and white. I'm sorry if I'm the first to tell you that, but it is black and white. But here's the trick, is that many times the black and white becomes gray. Because we justify, we rationalize, we have ways of convincing ourselves that it's not black and white. And guess what? I have done this many times. So I know the gray very well. Got to have this phone for work. I can't miss an email. Got to have internet access because what if... I have to work. I have to have this job even though it's causing me to sin. I've been there. I used to be a personal trainer at a gym. It's not a great environment for a person who struggles with lust. Nope. But I got to have a job. You know, other people seem to be able to do this, so I should too. Well, you know what, bro? And here's the good one. I can always find a way to sin, so what really needs to change is not my circumstances, but my heart. Okay, how's that going?
Come on, John.
Not only can we be pragmatists and say, how's that going? But you can actually look at the words of Jesus. You want to know how our hearts change? By cutting and gouging and throwing away. We cannot divorce them. We have this mentality that, I just have to have some sort of inner spirituality, some sort of inner meditative power in order to overcome sin. And Jesus says, no, dude, if something's causing you to sin, kick that thing to the curb. Be radical about it. Don't just leave it there and be like, no, I'm just going to get stronger so it's no longer a temptation. That wasn't Jesus' teaching on how to deal with sin. And he knew the severity of hell better than any of us. He knows. He goes on, the other side of the sandwich, the other loaf of this bread to sandwich divorce, first is how to deal with sin and lust. And then he starts talking about telling the truth. He says that we got to determine resolutely that we're going to speak the truth. And the first person we got to speak the truth to is who? Ourselves. I'm completely open with my wife about my struggles in sin, with lust and anything sexual, and anything else for that matter. We're completely honest with each other, and we're not deceitful in any way. And yeah, it hurts. Ask my wife sometimes. It hurts. And sometimes it's embarrassing, and sometimes it's shameful, and sometimes distrust is broken, and repairs have to be made. But all of that pain is less than the pain of having my whole body thrown into hell. I'm a firm believer of that. It's far better for my wife and I to have the pain and devastation that comes from honesty than a collapse of marriage and divorce for my children. The truth is never wrong. So as we kind of wind down here, on this first part of the Sermon on the Mount, and obviously it's high-level flyover, just touching on a few points here. I want to encourage you over the next couple weeks to please read Matthew 5 through 7 many times. I want you to read it multiple times in the next couple weeks for your quiet times. And I want to encourage you to read it in multiple versions and translations of the Bible. Matthew 5 through 7. It's important to remember here that this Sermon on the Mount, right, this greatest hits collection, this compilation record of Jesus' teachings in essence, it's not just about us. It's not about what we do or don't do. It's not just a way of having morality or some new law that he's laying on top of the Mosaic law. If it were that, we might admire it as a bit of fine idealism, but eventually we'll just go back to the way we live life. It's too idealistic. It's like what Don said. Can anybody really do this? No. Not perfectly. And that's the point. Right? Jesus says, this is about me. I am going ahead of you. And I am going to show you what it means to be fully human. I'm going to show you what God's intent is for you. What God's intent is for what humanity looks like together. A humanity that's reconciled. A humanity that resists evil, no matter the cost. Willing to pay anything for righteousness. The Sermon on the Mount is the blueprint of Jesus' own life. And in this, we see Jesus as the Emmanuel, the God with us person. Sermon on the Mount is not just about how to behave. It's about discovering the living God in his love and the death of his Son Jesus, and learning to reflect that love ourselves in a world that needs it so badly. Let's pray together as we close out. Jesus, thank you for being the firstborn from among the dead. Thank you for being our second Adam, the one who lived life perfectly, who did not eat of that forbidden fruit, but lived life perfectly, God. We're so grateful for that. We're so grateful that we have a vision of what that looks like, and we're not just groping around in the dark trying to figure it out on our own. And yet, when we see that vision, we are absolutely humbled. Wow, we fall so short. As I read the Sermon on the Mount, I'm like, I can't get through a single sentence without feeling humility, gratitude that Jesus, you have led the way. Not only have you led the way and paid the price, but you empower us. You empower us to live these new lives in this new kingdom, in this new humanity that you are creating. Help us, Father, to be faithful to you, faithful to your kingdom, faithful to the way you want us to live with each other, God. And I pray that your Spirit would convict if there is any sin amongst us that's being hidden or not dealt with, reconciliation that's not happening, God. Please, by the power of your Spirit, bring conviction and softness of heart. If somebody has an issue with me, God, I pray they come to me today, that they do not let the sun go down, and that we can experience your love together with each other. We love you, Father. We thank you for first loving us. In Christ's name.